It was a seemingly ordinary night in Amityville, New York, a crisp November evening in 1974. Inside 112 Ocean Avenue, the DeFeo family was settling in for what should have been a peaceful night of rest. But this would be no ordinary night. By sunrise, 6 members of the family would be dead. Their lives ended in one of the most shocking and brutal murders in American history. What happened that night? How did an entire family living in a quiet suburban neighborhood fall victim to such horror without a single cry for help or even the sound of gunfire alerting neighbors? To uncover the truth, we must walk through the events of that fateful night, step by step. It was a regular evening at the DeFeo house. Ronald Sr. and Louise, the parents, were in their bedroom on the second floor. Ronald Sr., exhausted from work, was likely already asleep, while Louise was preparing for bed. Also on the second floor, 3 of the 5 children occupied 2 separate bedrooms. John, 9, and Mark, 12, shared a room next door. Mark had been recovering from a football injury, so he was already in bed, propped up on pillows to ease his pain. John, the youngest of the family, was probably fast asleep. Allison, 13, was in her own room across the hall. Allison, the family's kind-hearted middle child, was likely reading. Dawn, 18, and Ronald Butch DeFeo Jr., 23, had their bedrooms on the 3rd floor, separate from their parents and younger siblings. Dawn was in her room alone, likely reading or journaling before sleep. Butch reportedly sat in his room, brooding over his anger toward his father and contemplating his next actions. Butch's presence in the house that night would soon turn a normal evening into a nightmare. It was approximately 3:15 a.m. when the first gunshots rang out. Butch DeFeo, armed with a .35 caliber Marlin rifle, entered his parents' bedroom on the 2nd floor. Ronald Sr. was the first to be shot. The bullet struck him in the back, tearing through his kidney and exiting through his chest. It was a fatal wound, but Ronald Sr., in his final moments, attempted to rise from the bed, perhaps to fight off his attacker. Butch fired a second shot, striking him again, this time ending his life instantly. Louise, startled awake by the sound of gunfire, barely had time to react. Butch turned the rifle on her and fired twice. The first bullet struck her in the back and the second pierced her chest. She collapsed onto the bed beside her husband, her life extinguished in seconds. The brutality of the scene was staggering. Blood soaked the sheets, and the room fell silent once more. Yet despite the loud and unmistakable sound of gunfire, no one else in the house stirred. After killing his parents, Butch made his way to the other rooms. The next room he entered was shared by Mark and John, 2 of the middle children. Mark, immobilized by his football injury, was unable to move or resist. Butch fired a single shot into his back, killing him instantly. The force of the bullet pushed Mark forward into his pillows, leaving him in a peaceful-looking position despite the horror of his death. Next, Butch turned his rifle to John, the youngest member of the family. The 9-year-old boy was fast asleep, unaware of the horror taking place just feet away. Butch raised the rifle and fired a single shot into his back. The child didn't stand a chance. Once again, no sounds of struggle or cries for help were reported. The house remained eerily silent, as if it were complicit in the unfolding tragedy. Allison, who had likely been awake and aware of the unfolding chaos, was the next victim. Butch turned the rifle on her and fired at close range. The bullet struck her in the face, obliterating much of her head. The force of the shot was so severe that investigators later described her injuries as among the most gruesome of all the victims. Finally, Butch turned his attention to Dawn, his 18-year-old sister. Her room was on the 3rd floor, separate from the others. While the exact details of what happened in Dawn's room remain murky, her position in the bed suggested she may have woken up during the commotion. Some evidence later suggested that Dawn may have tried to intervene. though this theory remains controversial. Regardless, Butch fired a single shot into her head, killing her instantly. Dawn's injuries were severe, leaving no doubt about the violence of her final moments. By 3:30 a.m., it was over. 6 members of the DeFeo family lay dead in their beds. Butch, covered in sweat and adrenaline, began to clean himself up. He disposed of evidence, including the rifle and bloody clothing, in a nearby storm drain. As the sun rose, Butch left the house and drove to work at his father's car dealership, attempting to maintain a facade of normalcy. But the weight of what he had done was too much to bear. By midday, he was at a local bar, frantically telling patrons that his family had been murdered. The most baffling aspect of the murders was the silence. The Marlin rifle used by Butch was a loud weapon, capable of echoing through the neighborhood, yet no one reported hearing gunshots. The victims were all found lying face down, with no signs of struggle. Toxicology reports revealed no drugs or sedatives in their systems, ruling out the possibility that they had been drugged beforehand. The eerie quiet of the house that night remains one of the most perplexing mysteries of the case. In just 15 minutes, Ronald Butch DeFeo Jr. destroyed his entire family and left a legacy of horror that would echo for decades. What drove him to commit such an act? Was it years of familial abuse, drug addiction, or something far darker? The events of that night leave us with more questions than answers, and the silence of the house at 112 Ocean Avenue continues to haunt those who dare to look too closely. While the physical evidence at 112 Ocean Avenue painted a vivid and horrifying picture of the crime, investigators were left with a series of baffling questions as they attempted to piece together the events of that night. Despite Ronald Butch DeFeo Jr.'s confession, the case was anything but straightforward. Experts and law enforcement officials found themselves grappling with a series of perplexing details that defied easy explanation. One of the most striking and unsettling aspects of the crime scene was the positioning of the bodies. Each victim was found lying face down in their beds, with their arms at their sides, as though they had been carefully arranged. There were no signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, no defensive wounds, and no evidence to suggest that any of the victims had attempted to flee. Forensic investigators were baffled. How could a single gunman systematically move through the house, firing a loud, high-caliber rifle without waking anyone up? Theories ranged from the victims being paralyzed by fear to the possibility of external influence, though no physical evidence supported the latter. The weapon used in the killings, a .35 caliber Marlin rifle, was incredibly loud. Firearms experts later recreated the conditions of the crime and noted that the sound of a single shot would have echoed throughout the house and the neighborhood. The weapon did not have a silencer, and neighbors who lived just 40 feet away from the DeFeo house reported hearing nothing unusual that night. Some investigators suggested that heavy rain and wind that night may have muffled the sound. Others proposed that the victims were drugged beforehand to keep them from waking, but toxicology reports found no traces of sedatives or drugs in their systems. The silence of the killings remains one of the greatest mysteries of the Amityville murders. The Amityville murders remain one of the most perplexing and horrifying crimes in modern history. The events of that night defy easy explanation, leaving behind a legacy of unanswered questions and a story that continues to haunt both investigators and the public. Was it the act of a disturbed young man consumed by rage and resentment? Or was there something darker, something we cannot fully understand, at work within the walls of 112 Ocean Avenue? The truth perhaps lies somewhere in the silence of that night.